27 million dead, it is not a number. It is the weight of a world that no longer exists. As the Western world remembers D-Day, the tanks in the North African desert, and the bombs on London, there is a different, more colossal, more cruel, more decisive war that occurred in the East. This is the history of the Red Army, the story of how the Soviet Union, with colossal mistakes, with millions of sacrifices, with generals learning under the heaviest fire ever seen, stopped, turned, and finally destroyed the Wehrmacht, the deadliest war machine Europe had ever produced. In 1918, revolutionary Russia had no army. It had militias of armed workers, mutinous sailors, and the scattered ghost of what was once the Imperial Army. Von Lenin and his Commissar for Military Affairs, Leon Trotsky, needed to build a fighting force from scratch in the midst of the bloodiest civil war that country had ever witnessed. The solution was brutal and pragmatic. Recruit tens of thousands of former officers of the Tsarist army, the so-called military specialists, and keep them under political surveillance through the system of commissars. Each unit had a military commander and a political officer whose signature was needed to validate any significant orders. It was a system of institutionalized distrust. It worked because it had to work. The Civil War of 1918 to 1921 forged the Soviet military mentality in a way that would persist for decades. Armored trains carrying reserves from one front to another, moving entire units along interior lines to plug gaps, created what would become known as echelon warfare. Some infantry divisions changed fronts up to 5 times over the course of the conflict. This experience generated a deep understanding of the need for strategic reserves, staggered in depth, a lesson the Red Army would never forget. But the Civil War also taught something else. Civil War commander Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky and theorist Vladimir K. Triandafilov came to a conclusion that would change the history of military art. Modern armies were too large to be defeated in a single catastrophic battle. You needed to dismantle the enemy with successive offensive operations, each followed by a quick exploitation to the rear before the defender could reorganize. From that principle was born what the Soviets would call the operational art, and within it, operation in depth. It wasn't just attacking, it was to attack simultaneously at multiple depths, neutralizing all enemy defenses at the same time, employing tanks, artillery, aviation and infantry, mechanized in a coordinated dance that prevented the defender from creating a firm front. In the 1930s, as the world looked the other way, the Red Army became the most advanced mechanized warfare laboratory on the planet. By 1936, the Soviet Union had formed its first 2 mechanized corps, 3 years before Germany created its first panzer divisions. That year's interim campaign regulations codified concepts that German theorists were just beginning to articulate. The Soviet arsenal included thousands of tanks. Production had reached 3,000 armored vehicles per year since 1933. The large-scale exercises tested the combined use of airborne armored and motorized infantry forces for operational penetrations of 100 kilometers or more. There was a problem, named Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin. Stalin's paranoid obsession with absolute control led him in 1937 to unleash a purge of the officer corps that rivals any military disaster in history. Tukhachevsky, the genius who had conceived Operation Deep, was arrested on May 27, 1937. On June 12 he was executed, along with the commander of 2 military districts and 6 high-ranking colleagues. The figures for what followed are almost inconceivable. The commanders of the country's 16 military districts were purged. 90% of the deputy commanders, chiefs of staff, and section chiefs. 80% of the commanders of corps and divisions. 91% of regimental commanders, their deputies, and their chiefs of staff. In total, between 34,000 and 54,700 officers were dismissed, imprisoned, or executed. Of the 5 marshals of the Soviet Union, 3 were shot. Military historian David Glantz, in his analysis of this period, concludes that the purges not only eliminated the intellectual elite of the army, but created a climate where any show of independent judgment could cost one's life. Young officers with no combat experience were suddenly elevated to division commands. Students of the 1938 course of the Voroshilov Academy, among them future luminaries such as A.M. Vasilevsky and M.V. Zakharov, graduated hastily to fill vacancies that no one wanted to fill. The army that existed in 1941 was, in the words of one contemporary analysis, magnificent but hollow. It had the formal structure of a powerful force. I didn't have the brain to operate on her. Between 1938 and 1941, the Red Army fought 3 conflicts that revealed everything that was wrong and at the same time gave glimpses of what could become. At Lake Khasan in 1938, Soviet forces clashed with Japanese troops for weeks before winning a costly and poorly coordinated engagement. The losses were disproportionate to the results obtained. Less than a year later, on the Khalkhin-Gol River in remote Outer Mongolia, an officer who had survived the Purges, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, was given command of the Soviet forces with instructions to resolve the problem with the Japanese. What Zhukov did on August 20, 1939, was a masterclass. He secretly concentrated 57,000 men, 498 tanks, and 385 armored vehicles. He staged a classic envelopment attack while a territorial division attacked head-on to lock on to the enemy. Within hours, the Japanese forces were locked in. The assault on August 27th to break the siege failed. On September 15th, Japan signed a ceasefire agreement. Zhukov had carried out almost perfectly the principles of Operation Depth that Tukhachevsky had articulated. Japanese casualties reached 61,000 killed, wounded, and captured. But the real revelation came that same winter. In November 1939, Stalin ordered the invasion of Finland after failed negotiations. What followed was a catastrophe. The Red Army, deprived of its best commanders and doctrine by the Purges, blindly attacked the defences of the Mannerheim Line. The 44th Rifle Division was almost entirely destroyed in the forests of Suomussalmi. His men, ill-equipped for Arctic combat, froze in their positions as Finnish skiers methodically encircled and dismembered them. The commander of the division was shot. Dozens of officers replaced. Soviet forces suffered 131,476 killed and missing before the situation was reorganized enough to break through Finnish defenses in February 1940. Timoshenko took command in the northwest. He trained his troops hard. He organized specialized raiding groups. He concentrated the artillery. On February 12, 1940, an entirely different attack, more precise, more coordinated, more concentrated, penetrated the Mannerheim Line. In March, the Finns signed the armistice. The outside world, and particularly the German High Command, saw only the initial disaster. Historian Carl Van notes that Finnish reports of Soviet improvement in the second phase of the Winter War reached German intelligence and were ignored. Hitler and the OKH drew the conclusion they wanted. The Red Army was incapable of defending itself. It was the most expensive miscalculation in military history. On August 23, 1939, Joachim von Ribbentrop landed in Moscow. Within hours, representatives of 2 regimes that had proclaimed each other mortal enemies for a decade signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Publicly, it was a non-aggression agreement. In its secret clauses, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence with a coldness that would have scandalized any diplomat of the previous century. Why did Stalin sign? The short answer is that he distrusted everyone equally. The Munich Conference of 1938, where France and Britain handed over the Czechoslovak Sudetenland to Hitler without even inviting the Soviets to the table, was an unmistakable signal to Moscow. Westerners would sacrifice the Soviet Union if it would buy peace for them. Stalin apparently calculated that if Hitler attacked the West first, the resulting war would last for years, giving him time to rebuild his army torn apart by the Purges. What he did not foresee was the speed of the French collapse. When France fell in 6 weeks in May and June 1940, Stalin suddenly found himself facing a Germany that controlled all of Western Europe, and his own army was still recovering. The pact had given the Soviet Union time, but not enough, and it had bought territory, parts of Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, that was now becoming a trap. The defences of the former Polish-Soviet border had been dismantled in order to build new positions in the newly acquired territories. Those new defences were incomplete. The army was ahead, exposed, in positions it could not defend. In the spring of 1941, the world's two most powerful armies were staring at each other across a border they both knew would not last. On the German side, 152 divisions, including 19 armoured and 14 motorised infantry, organised into 3 army groups. Approximately 3,350 tanks, 7,146 artillery pieces, and 2,770 aircraft. An officer corps with 2 years of blitzkrieg in Poland and France, accustomed to victory, trained in decentralized initiative-taking, with doctrines of mechanized penetration that had proven effective against the best armies in Western Europe. But the Germans also had hidden limitations. The Wehrmacht was not a fully motorized force. More than 600,000 horses were taking part in the initial invasion, dragging artillery and supplies. Infantry units marched on foot as in 1914. German logisticians estimated that the army had enough fuel to advance between 500 and 800 kilometers from the border. After that, it would need a pause to resupply. The Soviet railway system used a different gauge than the European one, which meant that German trains could not use captured lines without converting them. General Franz Halder, the German Chief of Staff, presented these figures with almost prescient precision in November 1940. They ignored them. On the Soviet side, on paper, a formidable army. In reality, an organism in transition, convulsed by simultaneous reorganizations, massive changes of command and incomplete defensive deployments. The 29 new mechanized corps approved in February 1941 had not received their equipment. Many of them had less than 40% of their tanks authorized. The 4th Mechanized Corps, considered the most powerful in the Soviet army, had 979 tanks, including 414 of the modern KV and T-34. But most of the mechanized corps had mixtures of obsolete vehicles, trucks requisitioned from civilian companies that could not operate in the field, and crews that had barely been with their machines for weeks. And yet, the T-34 was, in almost every technical respect, superior to any German tank deployed in June 1941. Its 45mm sloped armour withstood most German anti-tank guns. Its 76.2mm high gun speed pierced the armour of the Panzer IIIs and IVs at normal combat ranges. The German 37mm guns that equipped most of the infantry could not penetrate their frontal armour. The 47.5-ton KV-1 heavy tank was directly invulnerable to almost all German weapons except the Luftwaffe's famous 88mm anti-aircraft guns. If the Red Army had had 4 more years to prepare, the picture would have been radically different. He did not have them. At 3 a.m. on June 22, 1941, 30 Luftwaffe bomber crews crossed the Soviet border at high altitude. In groups of 3, they struck 10 major Soviet air bases at exactly 3:15, at the exact moment when a brief artillery preparation signaled the start of the ground war. When the sun rose, 500 bombers, 270 dive bombers, and 480 fighters attacked 66 Soviet airfields. The Red Air Force lost more than 1,200 aircraft on the first morning of the war, most of them destroyed on the ground before their pilots could take off. Soviet communications collapsed within hours. The civilian telephone network, on which much of the army depended, was destroyed by the airstrikes and the overwhelming mass of emergency reports. German sabotage units, the Brandenburgers, infiltrated in Soviet uniforms, cut telephone lines, captured key bridges, and wreaked havoc in the rear. On the Western Front, General Dmitry Pavlov, commander of the Western Front, lost control of his forces in the early hours. His armies from the Bialystok sector, the 3rd and 10th, were caught in a trap as German panzer groups engulfed them from the north and south. By June 26th, General Pavlov sent Moscow the desperate message: up to 1,000 tanks of the 3rd Panzer Group are enveloping Minsk from the northwest. There is no way to resist them. It was not an exaggeration. It was the reality. By the end of June, the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups had closed their pincers around a huge pocket west of Minsk, containing most of the 10th, 3rd and 13th Armies of the Western Front. More than 417,000 Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. The Western Front, as an organized force, had ceased to exist. Pavlov was executed shortly thereafter. But even in this unprecedented chaos, there were signs of things to come. In the south, General Mikhail Kirponos, commander of the Southwest Front, had been in close contact with the border guards in the previous days and alerted his units when the Germans were massed on the border. His front was blessed with 8 mechanized corps. None were completely equipped, none were fully trained. But General Konstantin Rokossovsky, commander of the 9th Mechanized Corps with obsolete T-26 tanks, made a decision that illustrated the birth of a new capability. Instead of attacking according to impossible orders, he established defensive positions and ambushed the main column of the 13th Panzer Division advancing towards Rivno. For the first time in the war, the German army encountered massive Soviet artillery fire and suffered severe casualties. The fierce battle for the southwestern Soviet flank delayed Army Group South by at least a week, buying crucial time that would allow the partial evacuation of Soviet industry to the Urals. On June 24, 1941, Stalin signed the order that created the Evacuation Council. Under the leadership of Nikolai Shvernik and with Alexei Kosygin as his deputy, the Soviet state undertook one of the most extraordinary logistical feats of the 20th century. Entire factories with their machines, their engineers, their workers and their families were dismantled and loaded onto trains leaving for the Urals and Siberia. The Zaporozhye metallurgical plant in the Donbass required 8,000 railway wagons just to be moved to Magnitogorsk. In the Leningrad area, where the German advance was so rapid that only 92 factories could be relocated before the city was surrounded, a former tank plant was converted into the complex known as the Tankergrad in Chelyabinsk, which by the end of 1941 was already producing more than 500 kV heavy tanks. By December 12, 1941, 523 enterprises and 564,248 workers with their families had been evacuated from the Moscow region in 100,334 railway wagons. The Soviet Union claimed to have moved a total of 1,910 large factories, including 824 armament-related factories, to the Volga, Siberia and Central Asia, on nearly 30,000 trains carrying 1.5 million rail loads between July and December 1941. Machinery arrived at its destinations on a confusing and staggered schedule, sometimes with only a fraction of the skilled workers. They were often unloaded into newly erected unheated wooden buildings in the middle of the Siberian winter. Workers worked under electric lights hung on trees, supplemented by bonfires, while outside temperatures dropped well below zero. Some factories were producing again within weeks, others took more than a year. The result was that, despite the initial collapse, the Soviet Union produced approximately 6,590 tanks in 1941, two-thirds of them the modern T-34 and KV. Comparatively, Germany produced 5,200. The USSR also produced twice as many fighter aircraft as Germany that year, twice as many guns and 11 times as many mortars. An entirely new war machine was being born in the bowels of the Urals, literally built on snow and sacrifice. When General Holder noted in his diary on July 3, 1941, that the Russian campaign has been won in the space of 2 weeks, it was a statement that, at that time, at the precise moment, it seemed backed up by the facts. All 3 frontline guns on the Western Front had been destroyed. The Germans were on the Dnieper and the West Dvina, less than 400 kilometers from Moscow. What Halder did not know was that on the other side of the Dnieper were waiting 5 armies that Marshal Boudeny had begun to assemble since the end of May. These armies were not front-line formations. The 21st, the 21st, the 22, the 16th. They were poorly equipped formations, many of them composed of reservists called up urgently, with poor communications, insufficient anti-tank artillery, and staffs that barely knew their own units. However, they were something the Germans had not anticipated. New meat for the mill. Stalin put Marshal Timoshenko in command of the Western Front on July 1st. In the days that followed, the Germans found crossing the Dnieper to be much more difficult than crossing the Dwina. Soviet counteroffensives were crude, poorly coordinated, and costly. But they existed. The German panzer divisions, which had advanced 700 kilometers in 2 weeks, suddenly found themselves locked into a fierce defense to which they were not accustomed. On July 18th, Guderian's panzer group had captured the heights of Elnya, 82 kilometers southeast of Smolensk. Their tanks had reached the logistical limit of their initial advance. German tankists could see in the distance the domes of the city's churches, which maps described as the gateway to Moscow. No fuel, no ammunition. The divisions were reduced to companies, the companies in platoons. The commander of the 18th Panzer Division wrote a note that captured the mood. "We need to reduce our casualties if we do not intend to earn ourselves to death." On July 23rd, Zhukov coordinated the first genuinely organized counteroffensive of the war. 4 operational groups attacking simultaneously from the north, east, and south against Army Group Center east of Smolensk. The attacks were uncoordinated, costly, and largely tactically unsuccessful, but they were continuous. For the first time in the war, Army Group Center had to stop to defend. On July 30th, Führer Directive No. 34 ordered Army Group Center to go on the defensive and prepare its forces for future operations. It was the first time the Germans had issued such an order since the Blitzkrieg had begun in 1939. While Timoshenko was holding back Army Group Center near Smolensk, the biggest disaster of the entire war was unfolding to the south. Marshal Semyon Boudeny, commander of the Southwest Directorate, had orders to hold Kiev at all costs. Stalin was convinced that the main German offensive would eventually come toward Moscow and that the southward movement was a distraction. Zhukov, on one of the few occasions when he dared to directly contradict the dictator, warned in August 1941 that Kiev was a trap. Army Group South was being reinforced for a huge pincer. The warning cost Zhukov the post of Chief of Staff. Zhukov himself asked to be transferred to the command of the reserve front. The premonition was fulfilled with chilling accuracy. Guderian turned his panzer group south, behind the lines of the southwest front. Kleist did the same from the south. On September 14, 1941, the two groups joined east of Kiev. In the following weeks, 4 Soviet armies were destroyed within the encirclement: the 5th, 37th, 26th, and 21st, a total of 43 divisions with 452,720 men and 3,867 guns and mortars. General Kirponos, who had warned of the danger and asked permission to withdraw, was killed during an attempt to break the siege. The German figure of 665,000 prisoners probably tripled the number of actual captives, but it approximates well the total Soviet losses in the operation. And yet, even in Kiev, the Germans paid a price. They had diverted their energy and resources from the main axis of advance. Time lost in the south. Almost 2 critical months could not recover. The Russian winter was approaching. The road to Moscow was intact, but the clock was ticking against the invaders. Operation Typhoon, the last German attempt to capture Moscow in 1941, began on October 2nd. 3 panzer groups, regrouped and partially resupplied, pounded the Soviet lines along a 350-kilometer front. What followed was one of the most dramatic moments of the entire war. In the first days, the pockets of Vyazma and Bryansk gobbled up more than 650,000 Soviet soldiers. In Moscow, on October 13th, Stalin ordered the evacuation of most government and party offices to Kuibyshev on the Volga. The announcement of this evacuation, combined with rumors about the fighting in Vyazma, produced on October 16th and 17th a situation close to panic in the capital. Only the radio announcement that Stalin remained in the city quelled the chaos. Zhukov was sent from Leningrad to take command of the Western Front. He found that there were virtually no forces to defend the road to Moscow. The desperate battle in the Vyazma pocket, led by General Lukin, won crucial days as fresh units arrived from Siberia. General Katukov and his 4th Tank Brigade, equipped with the new T-34s, used tactics for the first time that would become characteristics of the Soviet army. Ambushes from the forest, attacks from the flanks, controlled withdrawals that drew the German panzers into prepared anti-tank lines. Near Matsensk on October 6th, Katukov inflicted such damage on the battle group of Guderian's 4th Panzer Division that a special investigation was opened in the German General Staff. By November, the ground had frozen, restoring German mobility, and Bock launched his final onslaught. The 3rd Panzer Army arrived at Klin on November 24th. A bridge over the Moscow-Volga Canal was crossed, placing German tanks within 35 kilometers of the Kremlin. German officials claimed that they could see the city's towers through their binoculars. It was the closest point the Wehrmacht would ever reach. On December 4th, temperatures dropped to -15 degrees Celsius. German tank engines would not start without being preheated for hours. Soldiers without adequate winter equipment suffered from massive frostbite. The infantry divisions had lost more than 50% of their fighting strength in 2 months. At the same time, Stalin had quietly amassed 3 new armies. The first shock, the 20th and the 10th, fresh, well-equipped, and equipped with skis, which were waiting in the Stavka's reserve. The soldiers came from the cold, hardened Siberian military districts, prepared for the winter war that the Germans feared. At 3 a.m. on December 5, 1941, when the temperature was -15 degrees Celsius and snow covered a meter deep, the Kalinin Front launched the counter-offensive. The next day, the Western Front added its own attacks from positions north and south of Dmitrov. The nature of combat changed overnight. Soviet skiers and cavalry battalions penetrated between the villages that German units needed to survive. The T-34s advanced on roads that German tanks could not use. In the north, the 1st Shock Army drove the 7th Panzer Division from its bridgehead over the Moscow-Volga Canal. In the south, General Belov's cavalry cut off the supply route of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army. Within 10 days, Army Group Center had been pushed 100 to 150 kilometers westward. Klin was released on December 15th. Guderian repeatedly requested authorization to withdraw his army to more defensive positions. The OKH had no authority to grant it without Hitler's consent. On December 25th, following a final conflict with the new commander of Army Group Center, Feldmarschall von Kluge, Guderian was relieved of command. Hitler assumed personal command of the army. His fanatical resistance order has been criticized by generations of German military historians as another example of amateur interference. But in this case, most analysts conclude that the order was correct. The Germans lacked the resources and transportation to build a new defensive line. Defending on the spot, as hard as it was, allowed them to at least keep the rudiments of shelter and the supplies that would keep them alive until reinforcements arrived. What Stalin did not understand was that the December victory was not the prelude to the German defeat, but the end of his own strategic offensive. He demanded that his commanders extend the counter-offensive in all directions simultaneously, against Army Group North near Leningrad, against Army Group Center along its entire front, against Army Group South in southern Russia. Zhukov and Shaposhnikov warned that the available forces were insufficient. Stalin ignored the warnings. The counter-offensive spread. The cavalry units penetrated hundreds of kilometers into the German rear, but lacked the mass needed to explode. The 2nd Shock Army was sent through a breach into the rear guard of the German Northern Army near Leningrad. He was trapped, his men held out in nightmarish conditions for months. In June 1942, the commander who had been sent to rescue them, General Vlasov, was captured. His bitterness over abandonment led him to collaborate with the Germans, an act that Soviet historians meticulously erased from the records for decades. By the spring of 1942, the front line had stabilized, fatigue was mutual, and both sides were preparing for the summer. In May 1942, Marshal Timoshenko planned an ambitious offensive to recapture Kharkiv. In theory, it was a coup to dismantle German preparations for the summer. In practice, it was a catastrophe that illustrated all the outstanding problems of the Red Army. The plan was complex, depended on simultaneous coordination between multiple armies, and radically underestimated the German response capacity. Timoshenko concentrated 765,300 men and 923 tanks against the German Sixth Army. The May 12th attacks initially surprised defenders. In the south, General Gorodnyansky's Sixth Army advanced 60 kilometers in 2 days. The armored formations that were to exploit the success remained in their areas of concentration due to coordination failures of the General Staff. The Germans responded masterfully. Hitler authorized the transfer of Richthofen's 8th Air Corps from the Crimea and allowed Kleist to launch Operation Fridericus, a pincer attack from the south against the Soviet left flank. Guy von Schweppenberg's 3rd Motorized Corps, with 4 panzer divisions, cut off communications from the Soviet advance on May 17th. The Soviet 6th and 57th Armies, as well as 2 tank corps, were completely destroyed. The Germans captured 239,036 prisoners. The defeat at Kharkiv preceded the most ambitious German offensive of the summer of 1942, Operation Blue, which aimed at the oil reserves of the Caucasus and control of the Volga. Stalin, still convinced that the real German target was Moscow, kept his strategic reserves in the center while the southern flank collapsed. By the end of July, the Germans had reached the Caucasus. The 1st Panzer Army captured the small oil fields of Maikop on August 9th, only to find them systematically destroyed. Army Group B was advancing eastward along the Don, and on the horizon, a city that no one had paid much attention to began to take on disproportionate importance for both sides: Stalingrad. In 1942, Stalingrad was an industrial city of 600,000 inhabitants, spread over 24 kilometers on the west bank of the Volga, supplied equipment crucial military forces. But what made it the epicenter of the war was something simpler and more fateful: its name. For Hitler, capturing the city that bore his enemy's name had a symbolic value that surpassed any strategic consideration. For Stalin, losing it was unthinkable. Both dictators made the same decision at the same time, for identical reasons. This city could not be lost. General Vasily Chuikov took command of the 62nd Army inside Stalingrad in September 1942. His operational instruction, born of desperation, became doctrine. Embrace the enemy. To keep one's own lines so close to the Germans that German aviation and heavy artillery could not be used without destroying one's own troops. Fight meter by meter, building by building, floor by floor, in a war of proximity where the German tactical advantage was nullified. The battles for the ruins of Stalingrad's industrial complexes, the tractor factory, the Red October steel mills, the Barricadi munitions factory, are some of the fiercest in all of military history. Regiments arriving in the city with thousands of men dwindled to hundreds in days. Paulus's divisions rotated their units between active combat within the city and defensive positions on the flank. German casualties were steadily increasing. At the same time, the Stavka was executing something extraordinary: the most meticulous planning operation the Red Army had ever conducted. As the world stared at the ruins of Stalingrad, away from the spotlight, 2 Soviet fronts quietly amassed massive forces on either side of the German salient. General Alexei Antonov and the Stavka planners had identified the fundamental weakness. The flanks of Paulus's 6th Army were not protected by German forces, but by the poorly equipped Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, with few effective anti-tank guns. Operation Uranus would not seek to penetrate the Germans. He would surround them through his weaker allies. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 a.m., General Nikolai Vatutin's southwestern front launched the offensive. The temperature was -18 degrees Celsius. The 26th and 1st Tank Corps of Romanenko's 5th Tank Army penetrated the sectors of the Romanian Third Army in a matter of hours. 3 Romanian divisions, totaling 27,000 prisoners, were captured in the first 3 days. The Tank Corps advanced up to 70 kilometers per day, evading the centers of resistance. At dawn on November 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel G.N. Filipov staged a daring maneuver. He formed 5 T-34 tanks and 2 companies of motorized infantry in close column with all headlights on, and advanced toward the North Bridge at Kalash-on-the-Don as if it were a German column returning from operations. The German sentries let him pass. The bridge was captured intact. From the south, General Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps penetrated from the positions of the Romanian 4th Army. On November 23rd, the 26th Tank Corps and the 4th Mechanized Corps joined near Sovetskoye. The German 6th Army, 22 divisions, 330,000 men, was encircled. What followed was one of the darkest denouements in modern military history. Reich Marshal Göring promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe could supply the 6th Army by air. To sustain 330,000 men, at least 600 tons per day were needed. The Luftwaffe never exceeded 300 tons on any day. Many days he delivered less than 100. Soviet General P.S. Stepanov organized the first Soviet systematic air defense system of the war, concentric rings of ground-controlled interceptors and anti-aircraft batteries. The slow Ju-52s, the unarmored German transport planes, flew directly into these defenses. In the most intense period of the airlift, the German 4th Air Fleet lost 488 transport aircraft and converted bombers, more than 265 Ju-52s, a third of Germany's complete inventory. Marshal von Manstein was given command of the newly created Don Army Group with orders to open a corridor into the pocket. Operation Wintergewitter began on December 12th. Kirchner's 57th Panzer Corps, equipped with the newly reinforced 6th Panzer Division, advanced for 8 days, coming within 50 kilometers of the Stalingrad perimeter. He was arrested by Malinovsky's 2nd Guard Army. On January 31st, 1943, the newly promoted Feldmarschall Friedrich Paulus capitulated to the Soviet 64th Army. On February 2nd, all organized resistance ceased. From 330,000 men captured inside the pocket, approximately 91,000 marched into Soviet captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The 6th Army had ceased to exist. The victory at Stalingrad demonstrated that the Red Army was capable of planning and executing strategic operations on a scale that the Germans had not anticipated. But the weeks that followed also revealed that old problems persisted. Stalin's tendency to demand offensives on too many fronts simultaneously, and the army's inability to sustain deep exploitations without becoming overextended. In February and March 1943, as the Red Army attempted to exploit Stalingrad toward a general collapse of Army Group South, Manstein executed a masterful counteroffensive that recaptured Kharkov and halted the Soviet advance on the Donets River. Soviet units, exhausted after months of offensive operations, lacked the fuel, ammunition and reinforcements to withstand the blow of the SS armor, Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, that Manstein had expertly concentrated. But from the ashes of Soviet failure in the spring of 1943, something new was born. The map of the front, with its peculiar curvature, had created a salient that the Germans could only look at as an opportunity. The Kursk Bulge, a pocket 250 kilometers from north to south and 160 from east to west, which pointed west like a fist. The perfect trap. The Germans began to plan. The Soviets, perfectly informed thanks to their intelligence service, which included sources within the German headquarters itself, prepared to receive them. By the summer of 1943, the fundamental strategic decision in the Soviet General Staff was the most counterintuitive of the war: not to attack. Zhukov and Vasilevsky convinced Stalin that the Red Army must absorb the coming German offensive, destroy its offensive potential, and only then launch its own counteroffensives. It was not easy. Stalin had ended 2 consecutive winters with the feeling that victory was within reach, and that he had escaped due to timing errors. But the logic was irrefutable. If the Germans were going to attack at Kursk, let them attack. The Red Army built in the Kursk salient the most elaborate defensive network Europe had ever seen. 8 successive defensive belts, each made up of minefields, up to 3,200 per kilometer of front, anti-tank positions in depth and concentrated artillery. Each rifle company had at least 3 artillery pieces, 9 anti-tank guns, a self-propelled tank or gun, and a platoon of combat engineers within its position defensive. Artillery fire control exercises were repeated daily. All the whites were registered. Every meter of telephone cable was checked and retested. The battle began on July 5, 1943. Half an hour before the Germans planned to open their own artillery, Soviet artillery launched a preemptive counter-blockade. The effect was mixed. German gunners surprised in the open suffered badly, but in other sectors, the concentration positions of the assault troops were not hit. In the north, General Model's 9th Army attacked the fronts of Rokossovsky's 13th and 70th Armies. In 6 days, with massive support from Stuka bombers, it only penetrated between 8 and 15 kilometers inside the multi-layered Soviet defenses. Rokossovsky counterattacked with the 2nd Tank Army. Soviet Tank Corps closed the gap, launched counterattacks from the flanks, and halted the German advance on July 12th. Model had lost about 400 tanks and 50,000 casualties. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, with the fearsome Tiger, Panther and Elephant, penetrated deeper, up to 35 kilometers. But Vatutin engaged Katukov's 1st Tank Army in an active defense, burying tanks, launching continuous counterattacks from the flanks to tire and degrade the German armor. On July 11th, General Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army arrived on the battlefield after a 100-kilometer march on night marches. On July 12th, Rotmistrov launched his charge forward, seeking to reduce the Tiger's technical advantage by reducing it to short combat distances, where Soviet guns had a chance to penetrate their armor. The attack was costly. Rotmistrov lost as many as 400 of his 500 attacking tanks, but it served its purpose. He pinned down the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and fought it to a halt by July 13th. On the same day, July 10th, the Western Allies had landed in Sicily. Hitler ordered the withdrawal of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps to be redeployed in Italy. Manstein protested in vain. On the 18th of July, the 4th Panzer Army began its retreat to the initial positions. For the first time in the war, a major German offensive had failed to penetrate Soviet defenses into operational depths. On July 12, 1943, while the Germans were still fighting in the Kursk salient, the Red Army launched Operation Kutuzov against the German Oral salient north of the battlefield. General Bagramian's 11th Guards Army, with 170,500 men, 648 tanks, and 3,100 artillery pieces, created a penetration on the first day that Soviet Tank Corps exploded before the Germans could react. On August 5th, General Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army entered Orel. By August 18th, the German salient had been completely eliminated. 2 weeks later, without giving them time to reorganize, the Voronezh and Stepa fronts launched Operation Rumiantsev south of the Kursk salient. Katukov's 1st Tank Army and Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army exploited the gap created by the combined forces. Belgorod fell on August 5th. Kharkiv was liberated on August 23rd. The moment the planners of the German General Staff were trying to understand what had happened in the north, the south exploded. When they tried to stabilize the south, the north moved again. It was the concept of the successive offensive that Tukhachevsky had articulated in the 1920s, and that now, with a mature army and sufficient mass, was beginning to function with deadly precision. By the end of 1943, the Red Army was crossing the Dnieper at 40 crossing points, most of them improvised. Soviet engineers built rafts out of logs and drums of oil under German fire. The vanguard units were launched into the Dnieper in any available vessel. On November 6, 1943, Rybalko's tanks stormed from the small bridgehead of Lutezh, north of Kiev, and within 3 days had liberated the capital of Ukraine. The year 1944 was the year in which the Red Army proved that it could not only win battles but sequence them. Stalin planned 5 staggered offensives that began in the north and worked southward like a rising tide, preventing the Germans from concentrating their reserves at any point before the next point was hit. In the north, on January 14, 1944, the Leningrad front attacked from a bridgehead at Oranienbaum that had been secretly reinforced during weeks of night infiltration. The Second Shock Army, with 5 rifle divisions, 600 guns, and several armoured units, struck the flank of the German 18th Army besieging the city. A day later, the rest of the Leningrad front joined. By February 20th, the siege of Leningrad, which had lasted 872 days, was over. The city that the Germans had promised not to take but simply to destroy had survived. Its citizens had paid a price that defies comprehension. More than 1 million civilians died during the siege, mostly from starvation. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was the deadliest. As many as 100,000 people died in January 1942 in Leningrad alone. People would collapse in the street and die before anyone could help them. The ration of bread for non-combatant workers fell to 250 grams per day. For shop assistants, 125 grams. In Ukraine, the Soviet machine worked with an efficiency that would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Operation Korsun-Shevchenkovsky enclosed 2 German corps, the 11th and 32nd, in a pocket near the Dnieper. General Konev executed an elaborate deception operation, simulating the concentration of the 5th Guards Tank Army in the woods west of Kirovograd as that army moved silently 100 kilometers north. On January 24th, the 5th Tank and the 6th Tank Army closed the encirclement. The German rescue counterattacks came within 15 kilometers of the pocket. They never opened it. On February 17th, General Stemmermann gave the order to break with the survivors. At dawn, Soviet tanks and Cossacks on horseback cut off the fugitives. The Soviets claimed 55,000 Germans killed or wounded and 18,000 captured. On June 22, 1944, the exact 3rd anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the operation that many military historians consider the greatest defeat in the history of the German army began, not in Stalingrad, in Belarus. Operation Bagration was an exercise in strategic deception and operational concentration on a scale that the Germans had not thought possible. While the German armour watched south, convinced that the next offensive would come against Army Group north of Ukraine, where all German intelligence pointed to a huge Soviet concentration, the Stavka had quietly moved the 5th Guards Tank Army, the 8th Guards Army, and several other frontline formations from the south into Belarus, undetected by German intelligence. Feldmarschall Busch's Army Group Center had 63 divisions defending a front of nearly 600 kilometers. Only 4 divisions were available as operational reserves behind that line. Many units of these so-called reserves were engaged in anti-partisan operations in the rear. The defensive systems consisted of a cordon of trenches with no real depth. Hitler had designated several cities as fortresses, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, that were to hold out indefinitely, though none had the garrisons, supplies, or defenses to do so. On the night of June 19th to 20th, Soviet partisans launched a coordinated wave of attacks on railroad tracks throughout the rear of Army Group Center. More than 10,000 sabotage points were activated simultaneously. The supply, withdrawal, and reinforcement lines were paralyzed. On June 23rd, the armies of 4 Soviet fronts attacked at 5 points simultaneously. By June 25th, the German 53rd Army Corps was locked up in Vitebsk with 35,000 men. By 27th June, The 1st Guards Tank Corps and the 9th Tank Corps had crossed the Berezina and were beginning to converge on Minsk from the north and south, respectively. The German 4th Army, more than 100,000 men, was enclosed east of Minsk. On July 3rd, the 29th Guards Tank Brigade entered Minsk from the northwest, while the 4th Guards Tank Brigade entered Minsk from the northeast. That same afternoon, elements of the 1st Guards Tank Corps arrived from the south. The city fell in one morning with no meaningful defense organized. Within 12 days, Army Group Center had lost 25 divisions and more than 300,000 men. In the following weeks, it would lose more than 100,000 additional pesos. Operation Bagration cost the Germans 400,000 casualties, while the Red Army suffered approximately 180,000 dead and missing and more than 500,000 wounded and non-combat casualties. The operation as a whole destroyed 28 of the 34 divisions of the 3rd Panzer Army, the 4th and 9th Armies of Army Group Center, and the largest defeat in the history of the German Army. Hoover Institution Wikipedia. On July 17, 1944, 50,000 German prisoners captured in Minsk were paraded through the streets of Moscow. It was not a show of cruelty, it was a statement. The Soviet Union was telling the world that the war had changed direction permanently. While Bagration destroyed the center of the German front, the Red Army executed 2 additional offensives that extended the collapse to the ends of German-controlled territory. In the north, Operation Lvov-Sandomierz launched 3 armies of Marshal Konev's tanks into southern Poland. Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army, Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army, and Lelyushenko's 4th Tank Army entered Army Group north of Ukraine and within days had crossed the Vistula, establishing bridgeheads on Polish soil. By July 29th, advance units of the 1st Guards Tank Army had crossed the Vistula south of Sandomierz. In the south, on August 20th, Ukraine's 2nd and 3rd fronts executed Operation Iasi-Kishinev. In a move that perfectly reflected Soviet doctrine, they selectively attacked the weaker Allied armies of the Wehrmacht, the Romanian forces. 3 Romanian divisions were disbanded in the first hours. General Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army exploded to the south without significant resistance. 4 days later, on August 23, 1944, King Michael of Romania arrested Marshal Antonescu and proclaimed Romania's withdrawal from the Axis. Within hours, Romanian units that had been fighting alongside the Germans began to surrender to the Soviets. Within days, they were fighting their former allies. The German 6th Army, the same army number that had been destroyed at Stalingrad, was trapped in Kishinev's pocket. By September 5th, its last elements had been destroyed or captured. Total Axis losses exceeded 400,000 men. The Red Army advanced into the Balkans with a speed that turned entire countries into theaters of operations in weeks. Bulgaria declared war on Germany on September 8th. On October 20th, the Yugoslav partisans and the 3rd Ukrainian Army entered Belgrade together. By the end of 1944, the Soviet Army was dominant throughout Eastern Europe and part of the Balkans. On January 12, 1945, exactly 8 days ahead of schedule, accelerated at the request of the Western Allies who were being pushed back by the Ardennes offensive, Konev's Ukrainian First Front attacked from the Sandomierz bridgehead. Artillery preparation was an instrument of precision, not of brute destruction. The advanced battalions first occupied the German front-line positions with specific supporting artillery. When the main bombardment began, it did so with an elaborate sequence designed to fool the defenders. First, massive fire. Then, a silence of several minutes that induced the Germans to come out of their bunkers to occupy their firing positions. Then, another bombardment that trapped them in the open field. At 1400 hours on the first day, the 3rd Guards Rybalko and 4th Lelyushenko Guards tank armies were exploding through the attacking infantry divisions into the German device. By the end of the first day, the front had penetrated 35 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep. On January 14th, Zhukov's Belarusian First Front attacked from the Magnusiu bridgehead. The combined German armies of Buss's Ninth Army found themselves crushed under concentrations of up to 250 guns per kilometre of penetration front. By January 18th, Konev was 5 days away ahead of its programme. By January 19th, the former Auschwitz death camp was liberated, revealing to the world something that many already knew, but whose full scope no one could yet comprehend. The fighting of the summer of 1939 to January 1945 on the Eastern Front had produced casualties that define the limits of human language to describe destruction. Only between the Ukrainian First and the Belarusian First, in Operation Vistula Oder, did the Germans effectively lose the Ninth Army and the Fourth Panzer Army. Nering and von Sauken groups, what was left of entire armies, traversed 400 kilometers of Soviet-controlled territory in a desperate retreat toward the Oder. By January 31st, units of Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army had reached the Oder River near Kustrin. Only 60 kilometers separated these troops from Berlin, only 60 kilometers, and then Stalin stopped the advance. For decades, the official Soviet explanation for this halt was logistical. Zhukov's right flank was exposed, supply lines overextended, troops exhausted after 700 kilometers of advance in 3 weeks. All this was true, but perhaps there was another reason. On February 4th, 1945, the Yalta Conference began. Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill met in Crimea to decide the post-war world. Among the most important agreements, a protocol signed in London in September 1944 had divided Germany into occupation zones. The Soviet Union would receive Berlin and Eastern Germany regardless of who took the city. That agreement was confirmed at Yalta. But Austria, the Ostmark that Hitler had annexed in 1938, was not included in that protocol. Austria was, technically, an undivided territory. Stalin was the kind of chess player who never let a piece slip away without claiming it. On February 17th, just days after Yalta concluded, Stalin issued instructions ordering the Ukrainian Second and Third Fronts to prepare an offensive toward Vienna. The best tank armies, including Kravchenko's 6th Guards tank, were redirected south instead of west. On March 6, 1945, Hitler launched his last major offensive, north of Lake Balaton in Hungary. 10 panzer divisions, including the elite 6th SS Panzer Army of Dietrich, fresh from the Ardennes. The offensive penetrated deep into the Soviet front on the first day. Tolbukhin begged the Stavka to allow him to commit the reserves designated for his own offensive. The Stavka categorically refused. The front was folded. It didn't break. By March 15th, the German offensive had expired. The next day, the Soviet armies that had absorbed the heaviest blow turned and launched their own onslaught. Within days, the 6th SS Panzer Army was retreating faster than it had advanced. On April 13th, Kravchenko's tanks entered Vienna. Austria would be occupied by the Red Army. Stalin's objective had been accomplished. The next day, April 14th, Soviet artillery opened the preliminary bombardment along the Oder and the Neisse. Berlin was waiting. On April 16, 1945, at 3 a.m., 143 anti-aircraft searchlights illuminated the German front in front of Zhukov's positions at the Kustrin bridgehead. Zhukov's plan was ambitious, to use light to dazzle the defenders as his infantry advanced. The plan failed. Dust and smoke from the preliminary bombardment blocked the light. The German soldiers were not dazzled. They were simply pointing at the light to see where to shoot from. The attackers advanced towards their own searchlights. Chuikov's 8th Army of the Guards got stuck on the Silo Heights, a line of hills that dominated the only direct road to Berlin. Zhukov, watching from an advanced command post, lost his patience. He prematurely committed his tank armies, which were caught in the tangle of artillery and supply vehicles of the rifle divisions. 9 German divisions held underground had succeeded in slowing down all the most powerful machinery that the Red Army had ever concentrated on a single front. It was not until April 20th that Zhukov's forces had penetrated the German 4th Defensive Belt and begun the advance into the eastern suburbs of Berlin. Meanwhile, to the south, Konev was progressing better. His artillery had executed a more carefully calibrated preparation. On the first day, his forces had crossed the Neisse and penetrated 1.5 kilometers into the second defensive belt. On April 20th, the 3rd Guards Tank Army took the OKH headquarters at Zossen, 30 kilometers from the center of Berlin. Stalin watched and decided to encourage competition. In telephone conversations with Zhukov and Konev on April 17th, he blurred the dividing line between his two fronts in the vicinity of Berlin. The first to arrive would take the prize. On April 24th, Chuikov's 8th Guards Army and Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army joined with the vanguards of Rybalko's 3rd Guards Tank Army and Luchinsky's 28th Army, southeast of Berlin. The German 9th Army was enclosed, the city too. On April 29th, the first elements of the 79th Rifle Corps of the 3rd Shock Army began the symbolic assault on the Reichstag. On April 30th, scouts from the 150th Rifle Division waved the red standard over the building. Hitler committed suicide that same day. On May 2nd, Artillery General Helmuth Weidling, commander of the Berlin garrison, surrendered the last defenders of the city. The Battle of Berlin had lasted 17 days. It had cost the Red Army 361,367 sick leave, 81,116 of them irrecoverable. The Wehrmacht lost 458,080 dead and 479,298 prisoners. The magnitude of the Soviet contribution to the defeat of Nazism is difficult to communicate with numbers, but numbers are all we have. The Eastern Front absorbed approximately 75 to 80% of German military power throughout the entire war. At the most critical moments of 1941 and 1942, when Britain and the United States were just beginning to mobilize, the Soviet Union sustained the ground war effort against Germany virtually alone. The Red Army fought the largest number of battles against the largest concentrations of the German army during the entire conflict. Total Soviet military casualties are estimated at approximately 8.7 million killed in combat, with an additional 1 to 2 million killed in German captivity. Soviet civilian casualties directly caused by the war, massacres, starvation, conflict-related diseases, are estimated at an additional 14 to 17 million. The exact figures will always vary depending on the methodology and sources. The commonly cited total figure of 27 million Soviet dead is a widely accepted estimate that attempts to encompass all categories of losses. In terms of equipment, the Red Army destroyed or captured, according to estimates by the German General Staff's own estimates, 75% of all German divisions consumed in the war. The Wehrmacht suffered losses on the Eastern Front that increased every year. 1941 saw the greatest German advances with the lowest relative costs. 1942 was more costly. 1943 was the year when the Germans began to lose more than they could replace. 1944 was the collapse. 1945 was the apocalypse. What the Wehrmacht General Staff documented internally, and which its post-war memoirs tried to downplay, was that the Red Army by 1944 and 1945 was, by any objective operational measure, a first-class army. Their commanders, Zhukov, Konev, Rokossovsky, Vasilevsky, Malinovsky, Tolbukin, Bagramian, Vatutin, had learned under the heaviest fire in human history and had survived and grown precisely because the cost of error was death, their own or their soldiers' or both's. War economist Harold James observed that the Allies bought the German defeat in Soviet blood and paid in a can of Spam. It's not a perfect metaphor, but it captures a truth. The Anglo-American Lend-Lease was crucial in equipping the Red Army, especially the 409,000 trucks that finally enabled the deep exploitative logistics that Soviet doctrine had always demanded but never before been able to execute. But the price in lives was Soviet. The transformation of the Red Army between 1941 and 1945 is one of the most remarkable phenomena in military history. It began as an army decapitated by Purges, caught institutionally surprised, caught in transition between doctrines, with commanders terrified to take initiative, with communications that were collapsed under the first shock, and with logistics that could not sustain the operations that their doctrine demanded. 4 years later, it was the most experienced army in the history of mechanized warfare. Its commanders had learned to coordinate artillery, armor, infantry, and aviation in combined operations on a scale that no other army had attempted. Their staffs could move multiple armies in complex replenishments without enemy intelligence detecting it. Their strategic deception operations, the Maskirovka, were executed with a sophistication that repeatedly left the German OKH believing that the attack would come in the wrong sector. The price of that learning is incalculable. Each year of the war, the Red Army perfected its techniques while paying with millions of lives. The soldiers who survived the disasters of 1941 were veterans who had learned with their blood the lessons that no manual could teach. The officers who survived the Purges and the first months of the war had demonstrated under the most demanding conditions that they were capable of thinking under extreme pressure. There is a moment in the historical record that sums up this transformation better than any other. It is June 23, 1944, the exact anniversary of the German invasion, when 2.5 million Soviet soldiers attacked Army Group Center along 360 miles of front. The Germans did not see it coming, although they had been in their positions for weeks. The deception had been perfect. The concentration had been perfect. The execution was, in its first hours, perfect. By the time the Germans understood what was happening, it was over. That army of 1944 was unrecognizable compared to that of 1941. And yet it was the same army, he had learned, at a price that no nation should have to pay for any reason. Chapter 26. The Last Campaign, Manchuria. On August 9, 1945, just 3 months after the German surrender, the Red Army executed its last campaign of World War II, the invasion of Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Marshal Vasilevsky coordinated 3 Soviet fronts totaling 90 divisions, 5,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft. The Japanese Quantum Army had 31 infantry divisions and 12 independent brigades, but most had been created in the spring of 1945 with men who had previously been exempt from service or deemed unfit, and many were garrison divisions without significant artillery or anti-tank capability. Japanese intelligence had concluded that the mountainous and inhospitable terrain of Manchuria's flanks would make any Soviet attack from those directions impracticable. It was the same mistake that Army Group Center planners had made regarding the swamps of Belarus 2 months earlier. General Kravchenko's 6th Guards Tank Army crossed the border in the early dark hours of August 9th and within 3 days had covered 450 kilometers, crossing the passes of the Great Khingan Range, which the Japanese had been ruled out as impracticable for armor before Japan understood the threat. Lend-Lease's advances had included the American Sherman ships, whose narrower tracks proved inadequate for the marshy passages. The T-34s and BT-7s took the lead. By August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender. The Manchurian campaign, which many expected to last months, was resolved in 11 days of effective combat. Soviet casualties were 2,031 killed and 24,425 wounded. The Japanese much higher, although the imperial capitulation ended the organized combat before the encirclements could be completed. The Manchurian campaign was also a laboratory. Vasilevsky reorganized his tank armies with an experimental structure that integrated more motorized infantry and artillery support than any previous formation. The 6th Guards Tank Army included 25 armored and 44 motorized battalions with 1,019 tanks and self-propelled guns. It was the structure that the Red Army would study for its post-war period: more mass, more balance, more sustaining capacity. The Red Army's last bullet of World War II was fired in the Kuril archipelagos in the weeks following the Japanese surrender on September 2nd. Soviet and Japanese soldiers fought on islands that both knew no longer had any strategic significance. It was the inertia of war, which is the most difficult force to stop that exists in human nature. When the war ended in May 1945, the Soviet Union was the most militarily powerful state on the face of the earth. His army had destroyed the Wehrmacht. It had occupied half of Europe. He had liberated, or conquered, depending on one's perspective, entire nations. He had shown that the doctrine of Operation Depth that Tukhachevsky had articulated in the 1930s was correct, and that a sufficiently large, sufficiently capable and sufficiently determined army could annihilate any force that opposed it on the ground, and he had 26 million dead. Each medium-sized Soviet city had lost between 15 and 25% of its population. Collective farms operated with 71% of their 1941 staff. Women, the elderly and children sustained the economy while their sons and husbands died on the fronts in Poland, Germany and Austria. The Red Army returned home. Not to the easy celebration, but to the brutal work of rebuilding a literally destroyed country. Many veterans returned to find that their families had not survived. The cities in the western part of the country, Kiev, Minsk, Leningrad, Stalingrad, were ruins. In some regions, there were no men of working age left. The memory of that war was imprinted in the collective DNA of the Soviet nation. May 9th, Victory Day, became the holiest holiday on the calendar, not as a celebration, but as mourning. In Russian families, everyone can name their dead in that war: grandparents, great-grandparents, uncles who never returned. The memory of that sacrifice is the foundation stone on which everything that came after was built, for better and for worse. There is an image that persisted in the Soviet popular imagination: the photograph of the anonymous soldier who nails the red banner over the ruins of the Reichstag in Berlin. It didn't matter if he had been the first or the 10th to do so, if the photograph was recreated or authentic, if the soldier had 1 or 2 watches on his wrist, a detail that the Soviet censors would correct, erasing the evidence of looting. What mattered was the gesture, the flag over the city that had sent its armies to destroy them. That gesture cost 27 million lives. Let's not forget that. Never.